yeah. Fire, fire, yeah.
Chad, doesn't this look dystopian? Look at how many Taco Bells and Starbucks and McDonald's are around. Good lord.
Modern world is ugly. Our cities are a mess of glass and concrete, full of buildings
ugly.
made as cheap as possible. Modern interior decorating is even worse. Minimalism is king, and most newly made furniture barely lasts a year. Even the people look worse than they used to. Most Western countries now have far more overweight and obese people than healthy.
1 in 8 people are living with obesity. That's in the world. In the world. Not in America. In the world.
Ones. Looking back at our history and the beautiful buildings that have survived the
Nice.
test of time, it makes you nostalgic for a world that's almost completely disappeared.
Chat, 1 in 8
Despite
of
how
you is
far we've come,
obese,
we can wonder if
probably.
we've already seen the peak of human beauty and creativity. Was the peak really 400 years ago during the Renaissance period?
did.
And if so, why has the world become so ugly looking in most Western cities? Well, let's go straight
Wow.
into this global disfigurement and reveal why our modern world is just so ugly looking. Outside of the US, people have been talking for decades about a process called Americanization. For nearly a
It's American imperialism. Yeah, of course. That's been a thing for like centuries.
century, the US has been the premier world power in
Yep.
nearly every single way. Their culture has been dominant, its influence barely
And also exported.
had any limits. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to find a town or city anywhere in the world that hasn't been colonized by American companies, where the main central hub of every town square is a McDonald's, or the communal area is a Starbucks in Nairobi, or a Burger King in Peru. And for a lot of time, people did see this as a very good thing, which was helped along by the American media, who came to control a vast portion of the world's information. They could
The people that didn't say this is a good thing were called crazy.
spread the more enviable parts of American ideology, like ideas of personal liberty, equal opportunities, and the American dream. But while the world was getting drunk on consumerism and Budweiser, they also inherited other aspects of American
shitty
culture, the same
food.
ones that may have led to the world looking more ugly. Today, a lot of the hype behind Americanization and Westernization has died out. As people look around at their once beautiful towns and cities, all that's left is a bitter aftertaste. You only need to look at places like Rotterdam before and after the World Wars. Once a beautiful city just like Amsterdam, now just filled with glossy skyscrapers. And this is the same pattern throughout the West, as more and more people realize that the world just doesn't feel like it's designed for humans anymore. You can see one way this is
Yeah.
true in the physical
Cram everyone into the city so that they can work in the city. Yes!
world around us. It
Woo!
literally hasn't been designed with people in mind. A year before the beginning of the First World War, Ford created the first affordable mass-produced consumer car. By the time the Second World War brought American culture to the world, it was
Wait until people find out who made the tanks in World War II.
already everywhere. In many ways, the personal
Woo!
car symbolizes the rise of American culture. Ideally, it's almost the definition of personal freedom and individual capability. If you own one, you can pretty much go anywhere you want, whenever you want, as long as there are roads to drive across. American towns and cities built after this period were nearly all designed with the car in mind. It's why almost every city in the
Yeah.
US is all just centered around cars. And this
And
perfectly
highways.
complemented and enabled other American ideals. With the car, everyone could get their own slice of suburban sprawl, and their own personal car to traverse its great distances. The impact this had on the world people lived in is too massive to comprehend. With nearly everyone who works in the city living outside of the city and driving in, you need massive highways and road networks to accommodate all of the cars. Then you need millions
Ugly
of parking spaces
highways,
as well
Chad.
to store the cars. The noise and air pollution that cars create also doesn't help. Cars slowly destroy the roads they drive over, so you need to make the infrastructure out of cheap replaceable materials like tarmac and concrete. In addition, they're heavy, so these are also some
If you go to Texas, there are massive highways and literal concrete jungles everywhere. It sucks. So I couldn't live in Texas. It really does suck in a lot of ways. Yes, everything's convenient. You have all your stuff. You can order Amazon and it comes the next day. It is very much a fucking concrete jungle. Yeah.
of the only materials you can use anyway. Pretty soon, every American city was a sea of concrete and tarmac, completely
Yikers.
inhospitable to people. The suburban sprawl, combined with how common cars became, also made public transport an afterthought. People's homes became so spread out that it just wasn't economical for cities to bother.
This wouldn't be even half as bad if they actually had railroads in America, but they got bullied out by a legislature that was essentially lobbied by American car companies. I don't think we'd be in that bad of a spot if we at least had some form of transportation.
with it. When you live miles away from the nearest bus stop or train station, there's no real option other than driving yourself. America, with all of its relatively new cities and towns, epitomizes these problems. In lots of suburban America, they don't even bother to make a sidewalk. It can literally take 5 minutes just to cross the road. You'd have to be insane to walk anywhere in a world like this. Other countries try to keep a hold of their old way of life, but of course this wouldn't stop car infrastructure taking root as well. Even in a world where we still made things like Gothic cathedrals and classic theatres, cars and their infrastructure would still do a lot of ruin to it. Seeing these things next to each other would just be jarring, but instead we live in a world now where lots of our buildings match the grey functional roads we drive over.
Fun fact, some of the old architecture, because of the pollution that's created from acid rain, cannot be sustained because it literally melts it over time. Because that didn't exist when they were building those kinds of buildings. They're melting.
Architecture has gone through the same existential crisis that every other form of art has been through, and the results speak for themselves. Instead of beauty and virtue epitomized through architecture, we see the most cost-effective, profitable buildings spring up, that oftentimes are just hideous to look at. So then how did we go from beauty to deformity? Beginning in the 1900s, the world of architecture began stripping away its own preconceived ideas and standards. All of the old ideas built on thousands of years of theory and culture were thrown out to try and find a new way of doing things. One of the schools of thought that came out of this upheaval was Modernism. It focused entirely on function and simple geometry, which wasn't necessarily ugly by itself. There are plenty of beautiful modernist buildings.
I don't know. It's kind of a hit or miss. It really depends, and also I think it kind of takes away from the skyline, to be completely honest.
Like the Sydney Opera House, for example. But these ideas unknowingly set the template.
I mean, I disagree.
For the next century of buildings. It wasn't just the modernists that were interested in function over form. Anyone trying to build something on a tight budget is also going to be unconcerned with how the end product looks, as long as it fits the role it was meant for, which makes a lot of sense. And this isn't really anything new, of course, as this is how nearly all buildings have been made since the dawn of time. But another development meant that modernist techniques and materials became a perfect match for these basic principles. It's a basic fact of nature that animals will generally choose the easiest, most efficient way of accomplishing a task. It's a simple calculation. Every bit of energy you save securing your next meal makes it more likely you'll have enough stored up to get the next one. And humans are the same. While it isn't a hard rule, you'll generally find that people do things in the cheapest, most efficient way they can with the resources they have access to. This principle has been essential in deciding how we've shaped the world around us throughout all of our history. Hunter-gatherers made their homes using the animals they hunted and whatever else they could get their hands on. Later on, when people started building permanent homes, the same principles came into play. They used what they had the easiest access to. Local stone and wood was the best you could hope for, as well as mud, straw, manure, or whatever else was available. Really, when we compare the buildings we used to have to what we have now, there's a massive amount of survivorship bias. The only buildings that got preserved from these times had unique characteristics compared to the rest. They were made out of stone or other materials that don't quickly degrade, or they were beautiful or important.
Well, now we have acid rain and it's kind of ruining all buildings, like I said.
Compared to other buildings, and people put the time and effort into keeping them standing. While lots of churches, cathedrals, palaces, and monuments have survived from the
look at that castle! Oh, chat, let's go buy a castle in Europe somewhere. It's probably cheaper than some places in America. Yeah, we could have a smuggler. Like, we could have like 2 smugglers in each room.
medieval period, the millions of mud huts and straw cottages didn't. It's only the most beautiful buildings that stood the test of time, so the past was probably a lot uglier than those buildings imply. But even with this caveat, there's still a lot more things that make our modern world much uglier than any of these previous periods of history. The city of Aberdeen in Scotland rests on a bed of granite, so most of the buildings are made of that certain kind of grey stone. Meanwhile, houses in the Cotswolds in the southwest of England are made of a unique kind of
Dude, cottagecore in England? That shit makes me so comfy. Like, say what you want about England, I think it's so cozy.
Limestone common in the region. Before the modern period, everywhere was like this, and it gave places their own unique character all over the world. But this all began to change in the 20th century. Suddenly it became cheaper nearly everywhere in the West to import materials rather than to mine or gather them locally. Even when you're literally standing on the same rocks your ancestors used to build their homes, it's still cheaper to use reinforced concrete instead. So suddenly, any developer trying to save money was relying on bricks, concrete, steel, and glass. And the result was the homogeneous, aesthetically boring world we live in. It was worse in the US, which which had less architectural history to lean on compared to other countries and a greater need for new infrastructure. But today that's almost all been completely forgotten. All human touch is gone, and the principles that guided how we changed the world around us fell away, except of course for functionality and profit. Once we started making the entire—
And that's where it becomes a problem. We overthrow everything for profit. Yay! We can thank the revolution for that. The Industrial Revolution that's led to this.
A world about factories, only economics mattered. Modernism took these principles and applied them to how we made buildings and cities, embodied in the—
By the way, I have to preface this. I live in a world where I can communicate with people on a whim through international means, through the internet. My ancestors wouldn't be able to do that. We have progressed so far, but there are definitely things that I am allowed to criticize as a person. It does suck when I go to America and I go to a town and everything looks the same. I think it sucks. I miss looking at buildings and being like, wow, I wonder what it was like to live in this building or work in it. Yeah, we've lost a lot of like fundamentalism. Soulless, progression comes at a cost. Yeah, it does. We're progressing so fast we can't even keep up with ourselves at this point.
American way of life, but they were just patient zero for the epidemic. These principles aren't American, they're human. It was just the Americans that got there first and spread it around. Suddenly the only things that mattered were cutting costs while providing the bare minimum of functionality. Beauty and meaning were now afterthoughts.
The Mall of America is surviving the so-called retail apocalypse, but that's because it's less of a shopping destination than a retail-themed tourist attraction.
It's funny because people complained about malls back in like the 70s and 80s, and now malls are dying because of Amazon. And we've come full circle. The little worm got eaten by the little fish, and now the fish is getting eaten by the shark being Amazon.
But for malls that lack an indoor
malls,
amusement
man.
park and an
I
aquarium,
do.
the future looks much bleaker.
A great example of this is the American mall. In their prime, malls were the foundation of America's strong consumer economy, and also just the foundation of communities. They were absolutely massive and seemingly everywhere, always giving every US citizen a taste of the good life. Their size meant that pretty much every kind of
fun,
shop was in
man.
the same place. If you needed anything other than the bare essentials, the mall was the place to go. They also importantly gave people a third place to exist other than home and work. Kids were a massive part of their success, as they dragged their parents there so they could see their friends or go to the arcade. A few decades later though, and malls are dying off in their thousands. At their height of popularity in the 80s, there were over 2,500 in the US alone. By 2022, there's only 700, and as
I know for a fact somewhere in a town nearby that the biggest mall is just dead. It existed since like freaking like the 1980s and it just died, like just straight up. There's like a couple of businesses that still exist in there, but they just don't like do anything with them. It's like these wide open big spaces and nothing's there. It's
estimated that only
scary.
150 of them will be left in a decade's time. There are tons of reasons for this sharp decline. Some of the biggest are online shopping and people
Amazon,
just generally
thanks,
getting
dude.
poorer. But in many ways, it's a change in culture that sealed their fate.
I think Amazon definitely is the biggest factor. Say what you want, but going out and, you know, getting dressed and getting money or, you know, going out and seeing your friends, it's not as convenient as like going and typing Amazon in your underwear and being like, okay, it's coming like in a couple of days. Yeah.
In our world of instant access, it was doubtful that people would ever go to the mall when they could easily just get stuff delivered with the click of a button.
Yep.
But the experience itself of going to the mall has gotten so much worse as well, as when the profits started to dry up, the owners began cutting corners. They would rent out space to anyone who would buy it, and they didn't bother with key maintenance. The shops got worse, and the malls themselves became run down, creating a deadly spiral. Soon enough, nobody really wants to go to the mall anymore because it's falling apart and all the good shops have left. And now that there's no one going, there's no sense of community either. That modern design that looks so clean and stylish in the 80s just didn't age well at all. Just like
It's so weird how we used to think that the malls were like insanely consumeristic, but there was really a social aspect to it that people really miss. Yeah, like what happened, man? Even the consumerism of a mall had a fun social aspect attached to it. Meeting your friends, waving to them. Oh yeah, food courts. Meeting your friends there. Maybe you bump into your rivals and stuff. Like, I'm a pretty antisocial person, but I thought it was fun going to malls and just looking at people.
Most modern architecture, leaving malls now looking more like dilapidated warehouses. Malls have also lost their best representatives in children. Kids stopped caring about the mall because they could get what they wanted from other places. And as nobody was going, hanging out with your friends, window shopping and playing video games could all be done from the home, or just virtually. And once kids moved on, it was pretty much over for malls. Now, funnily enough, European malls actually haven't suffered as badly. They're much more integrated into towns and cities, and they were never really separate from the rest of life. Most
Well, the big difference is they're not in America. They at least have some sort of legislation and stuff. Yeah, there's very likely legislations for like malls and buildings. And like it to like keep it together close to the people where they live.
malls in the UK, for example, aren't even really recognizable as malls. They're normally in the middle of towns and cities, which isn't really feasible using the American template.
Yeah.
American malls have massive car parks, which take up miles of space.
Yes!
In the UK, for example, the parking is normally underground or in a multi-story building. UK malls are also generally much smaller, with a greater focus on restaurants rather than massive specialized stores. You can just walk in when you're out
true.
and about rather than having to drive 15 miles into the middle of nowhere. But an often unrecognized reason behind the death of the mall is also what's behind the death of many towns and cities in general. It's no secret that outside of the largest cities, independent businesses have been dying off in their thousands. In 2024, retail closures in the UK reached nearly 14,000.
Wow.
Independents were hit much harder than chains. They made up 11,000 of the closures, which is more than 80%. And it's all part of a
See, even EU is suffering with this problem. After COVID, I think it genuinely took such a big hit for everyone. Say, yo, America, yeah, the capitalism is gonna dry up, chat. It's not gonna dry up, it's just gonna go to Amazon. The fact that people are scared of Amazon going into their country in like the UK or Europe or South America, I think is very telling. They are terrified that it's gonna happen to them too, and it is happening. I know that there's another video that this guy talked about where there's entire villages that are closing down because why would you live in a village when you can just move to a city and get Amazon, essentially, or like get delivery? Because they don't deliver out there, but they're kind of pushing for it by closing down villages inadvertently because young people are moving out.
process that's been going on for decades now. Shopping centers, high streets, malls, and retail parks all look suspiciously similar. The same process that hit malls so hard, like online shopping, have been terrible for retail profit margins. And then add in insane rent hikes, and it's surprising that more haven't shut their doors. While chain stores do feel the effects, they're obviously much larger companies and they can spread out the pain across their stores.
I don't understand America's obsession with highways. It's not about America's obsession, it's the American car companies lobbying for this. Americans don't want this. Do you think people like living in Houston, Texas, and sitting in traffic for 4 hours just to get across town? It does not physically take 4 hours to get across town. It's because of traffic. Yeah, yes, America is very big. I won't deny that, but it definitely does not take that long to cross physically with a car with no traffic. It does not take 4 hours. Probably like 1 to 2 hours.
If one location has a rough year, it doesn't matter as much. Chains can also control overall prices much more easily, secretly colluding with competitors and squeezing the consumer when they need to. Independents obviously don't have this luxury. If the town they're in is on the decline, or if something else happens locally which impacts their foot traffic, they're pretty much doomed. They can't even charge higher prices because people won't pay them. And while you may on the surface want to save independent stores, people rarely translate those ideals into daily habits when it's just more expensive. But the result of all of this is that
path of least resistance. Why would you pay more? I mean, again, it's so fucked.
Everywhere just looks the same. You get the same decrepit modernist buildings and the same selection of chain stores and businesses everywhere you go, and attempts to breathe new life into towns rarely ever work. Much needed redevelopment programs falter and just everything gets covered in orange tape for a decade or so, hitting businesses even harder while construction's underway. In the best of cases, they're just treating the symptoms, not the disease. Now, it's not just the malls that are falling apart. Whole towns and cities are suffering the same fate. The worse they get, the less people want to spend time there, and it just spirals out of control. This process has killed countless communities across the US and Europe as well. Some of the larger cities where there's enough money to keep walkable open spaces which have traditional architecture have actually survived. Is why people romanticize Europe so much. But the majority of towns and cities without these advantages are falling apart massively, and the
little villages are dying because young people don't want to live so far away from the city, which is away from opportunities. Like, I know we like to shit on America and stuff, but Europe definitely has this issue where those little towns are bleeding out and leaving all the old people behind, and then they're dying. Well, not the old people literally, but the town dies itself. The little grocery stores, the little mom and pop shops, the little restaurants that keep things afloat, they die and eventually have to move to the city, or they just die out naturally.
Populations are feeling the effects socially too. I mean, this is a huge part of why people feel so isolated. Today, lots of towns and cities just feel oppressive, bleak, and constrictive. It can feel like you're walking through a prison, which isn't surprising considering how they're designed. In fact, modern urban planning and modern towns and cities in general borrow a lot of design ideas from prisons, with the most obvious being
Oh my god, what?
A recreation of the panopticon. First popularized by the late 18th century philosopher Jeremy Bentham, the panopticon began as an idea for a new way to make prisons. Designed to minimize the amount of guards you need, a panopticon begins with a central guard tower. Shutters on the tower make it so that the prisoners below can't see in, but can still be watched from above. The cells and the living areas are laid out in a circle around the tower as well, making sure that wherever you are in the prison, you can always be watched. This way, you only need a few guards in the prison at any one time, because the prisoners can't see the guards, they're always potentially being watched. The design combines both the constriction and oppression of concrete rules and steel bars, with the openness to surveillance that comes from open spaces.
But
this design never really worked in prisons themselves. Small windows, cell doors, and other practical problems meant that it was never really feasible. But it did have a massive effect on inspiring other types of architecture, and it eventually found its way into the modernist movement and its even more oppressive offshoot.
Oh, it's like brutalism, isn't it? That's where it came from, huh?
Brutalism. Take the housing estates that sprung up throughout the mid-20th century in the UK. At first, they were the only route lots of people had out of the slums and into a better life. Modern amenities were combined with modernist architecture, and at first, they were actually...
And again, this is all because of the Industrial Revolution. In the UK, it was a really big deal that the Industrial Revolution happened and everybody started moving into the inner cities, and it was so overpopulated that they needed to spread out and build more. But they didn't have the space, so they had to accommodate by building tall and wide around certain spaces like that. It sucks!
Great. Often maintained to high standards by the residents, they were great for creating thriving communities. But today, no other building shows the detrimental effects of modern architecture more clearly.
Like this. Pretty much. It started back then, like a long time ago. Like, what, 400 years ago? Maybe 300? I can't remember.
First, lots of them are laid out in the panopticon style. Large blocks of flats are positioned...
And it's funny because this kind of thing exists in Spain, but it's a courtyard it's not as packed, and you're not packed like little sardines either, because having a courtyard in the middle of a space where people live is totally normal, and it's actually very insulating. This is just so strange because you're building upwards essentially instead of giving people space outwardly.
In circles or squares, so it feels like you're always surrounded at all times.
And tall too.
A great example of this is the Pepys estate in southeast London. This is oppressive all by itself, but much more so when everything else is falling apart as well. And as if that wasn't enough, modernist and brutalist architecture often use lots of overhangs. These massive concrete protrusions loom over residents as they leave their homes, making them feel even more crushed and enclosed. And brutalism puts a
Oh, this is so ugly. Oh my god, I'm gonna pukers. Dude, imagine living here and then living on this corner, and you're just like right next to each other. Ugh.
bunch of focus on unnatural shapes like this. Even in estates and towns which aren't literally designed like a panopticon, the effect is still there. Modern surveillance means you don't need circular courtyards and guard towers. CCT is everywhere, and the UK itself is the most surveilled country in the world except for China. It isn't just the concrete and steel that makes the modern world feel like a prison, it's all of these other things on top of it as well. Just going into a modern shop today is like this, with cameras everywhere, guards at the door, and a cold, hostile atmosphere. And the worst part is, it's the same outside as well. We now live in a world designed to maximize profit and press people into compliance. And one of the worst parts about all of this is that even if there was enough money floating around to change all of this, it might only get worse. As we'll see in our last example later on, lots of money and investment often means things get even more artificial and alienating. There's a sense of inevitability with this change in the world, like it was always going to happen. It's not limited to one culture, otherwise it wouldn't have happened around the world all at once. Instead, it's because our technology and our society finally gave us the means to completely transform the world around us. We lost lots of the limits on what we could do, and the world became uglier as a result. But it doesn't have to be. Yet it did, because it changed to almost completely line up with the principles of profit and functionality above everything else. All of these awful changes we've discussed are expressions of this greed that was always within us, and it manifested itself within our cities, as it's only recently that we've become able to imprint that onto the world itself. It didn't matter that most people didn't actually believe in these profit-driven principles, or thought that this world was ugly. Those principles are just what our society rewards in people. Naturally, the power-hungry always end up with power, and societal pressures pre-selected these.
That's why I refuse to believe that no person is truly... like, every person is truly only in it for themselves. Even if you say that you aren't, and you're the most wholesome chungus, whatever... If you give someone enough money, they can change, and they will change. It just takes a matter of time, in my opinion. I know it's a grim outlook, but I think everybody has the potential to be evil. It's just a matter of how much would it take for you to become evil. Yeah.
Industrialists based on these principles, then gave them the power to change the world to suit themselves. You don't need to spend much time looking to find a perfect example of this in our modern world today. Every major city has been a victim of this. Some are more impacted than others, and at the very bottom, you have cities like Dubai. While you could make the argument that Dubai is beautiful in some sort of way, it can...
Oh yeah, Dubai is such a massive example of this as well. A country that did not have any money, and they suddenly got a lot of money, and this is what happens. They completely destroyed their own environment. They created fake islands, imported sand that wasn't even sand from their own, what is it called? Like their area, I'm pretty sure they imported it from other countries or other islands that aren't close or nearby. It's insane. I remember studying this in school, I'm pretty sure. The little islands that formed.
Only ever be skin deep. Underneath the surface, they're monuments to wealth, profit, exploitation, and greed. And it's really horrifying when you actually think about this and how these buildings were made. Despite the trillions of dollars spent, Dubai just isn't beautiful. The principles behind its creation are fundamentally in opposition to beauty, and it's possibly the furthest you could get from anything natural. In fact, lots of Dubai is intentionally made to replicate the natural world. It ends up though as a warped reflection, showing both what we've lost and how futile it is to try and recreate it. Take Dubai's man-made islands. Laid out to resemble palm leaves in a map of the world, their very existence goes against the natural world. The very sand they're built on doesn't come from the surrounding area.
I don't get that. Why didn't you just take sand from your own place? Like, I'm sure it wouldn't have been that much better. Obviously, because you're terraforming where you shouldn't be terraforming, because terraforming is supposed to be natural. But it's like importing sand from another country? Huh?
Desert sand is too loose and would wash away too quickly. Instead, they pulled up millions of tons of sand from the bottom of the ocean to build the islands. It all exists as a gross exaggeration of the principles that made the modern world so ugly. It isn't surprising that the newest, most artificial, most profit-driven cities in the world are also the ugliest. Beauty is fundamental to living in a meaningful life. It's why people flock to Europe.
If it's unfit for the islands, don't make the islands then. I don't know. I just think it's so ugly and stupid. I think the opposite. If I had like a country, right? Like if I'm like a president of a country, I would probably put more pride into like the national parks or something and not make something artificial. Why wouldn't you make an emphasis on like, I don't know, tourism and touring like the desert in Saudi Arabia? Yeah, why would you do the opposite? Be like, wow, nobody else has this kind of thing. There's not a lot of deserts in the world. There's only like a couple. They're massive, but yeah, it's a unique thing. Why not?
During the summers, just to get a glimpse of a past world that used
Why
to
make it an
exist,
artificial
where beauty and
island?
transcendental
Ew.
meaning were valued above all else. And this was reflected in the towns and cities across Europe. As beauty in lots of cases is the only thing that gives people hope to keep going. But as a society, we've given up on this completely. And now the entire world is paying the price. The deaths of so many different communities around the world is the most damaging consequence. We're living in a world that isolates us from nature and from each other. Town squares are being decimated. Places where you'd actually get to know your community and neighbors now really no longer exists. It's all just giant streets, strip malls, and fast food chains. Alienating
We don't even have malls anymore. That's what's fucked up. The thing that was killing communities and consumerism on all the little mom pop shops, they ended up getting eaten too. I can't get over that, to be honest.
us because it isn't designed for us
Crazy.
and we're not designed to live in this. So we of course resultantly retreat into ourselves and into the digital world, which doesn't offer us any real meaning either. And we're all paying the price for not understanding the value of beauty. But finally we might be seeing some change though. With the fairly recent pushes for more green spaces in cities and more walkable areas, things might slightly get better. But even then, it still feels like people
lobbyists
trying to preserve
destroy
beauty
that.
are always on the defensive. They're fighting a giant war against economics, and it goes about as well as you'd expect. But as a result, this will weigh on the soul of everyone slowly and miserably. And at the end of the day, the only things that really matter are people's day-to-day lives. When something can have this much of a negative effect on them, it can't be ignored.
Woo! That was a bit doomerish, huh? No, it's fine. It's fine. Chat, if I become president, I'm going to fund beautiful parks. I'm going to fund businesses. I'm going to take your taxes and put them into VTubers. It's a big club and we're not in it. True, actually. I'd probably get shot before I became president. Yeah, they'd hear me trying to be like nice and stuff, and they're like, Alana's being nice. You can't have that. You have to be mean. You have to be horrible.
Fire, 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 fire.